starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. To say that history textbook's goal isn't to be understood is a very crucial point that we need to dig deeper in this debate, because we believe that history should be presented to the citizens so they can further understand the status quo of the history that is told. We believe that in post-conflict state, history education should first appear coherent, serve stability, and uniting the nation. This debate isn't about whether citizens matter or not, because of course they are. At the end of the day, the question is, should history textbook prioritize emotional and fragmented stories of the conflict over national stability when we are rebuilding the nation? Good morning, honorable adjudicators, respected opponents, and my fellow debaters that is present here today. I am Cahyaningtyas Christian from Senior High School 1, Sragen, standing here before you today to be the leader of opposition, and I am ready to challenge the government's flawed case presented by the government of the motion in post-conflict states. This House believes that history textbook should focus on teaching bottom-up historiography rather than top-down historiography. Ladies and gentlemen, what we just heard earlier was an argument based on assumption rather than analysis, and for that, today, we as the opposition intends to challenge every assumption made on government's arguments. Before I start my speech, let me first say we can agree on the points of setup that proposition stated and the definition that proposition stated. However, we strongly disagree with the assumptions attached to their arguments. As leader of opposition, I will start to demonstrate how coherent and cohesive understanding are greatly needed to reach national stability. However, before moving further, I would like to state that we reject the assumption that top-down historiography merely glorifies the elite and simplifying the stories, while bottom-up represents justice and safety. We believe both perspective matters, but in a post-conflict state, top-down historiography will stabilize for rebuilding the nation. Now, let me state the flaws of government's argument. The proposition or arguments argue that top-down historiography lacks the relatability to citizens. However, we believe that in a post-conflict state where the citizens are still blinded with traumas, grief, emotions, reopening an old wound is far more cruel for them. The people who fought and died for the nation surely doesn't want their loved ones to be continuously grieving for their death because of the history that are told by the government. Top-down historiography is not merely simplifying what happens in battlefield or glorifying the elites that are also protecting the nation. Top-down historiography serves to be a stabilizer in a rebuilt nation. Top-down historiography wasn't made to be setting aside the citizens that also fought and died for the nations, but we believe that in a post-conflict state, history education should first serve as a stabilization. Again, I'm still continuing to point out the government's flaw, which is the proposition stated that there is so many different aspects that can be analyzed. But if we are thinking about what state the citizens are in that status quo, it would be harsh to put that analysis upon them. They are forced to understand a lot of perspective with a fake objectiveness. Again, we stated that top-down historiography doesn't mean we don't care about those who fought for our nation. By focusing on institutions, national movement, leadership decision, and major historical events, students can now gain a shared understanding of how their country developed. And after the nation is stable, the students can now learn the effect on citizens. Now, after I point out the government's argument flaw, I will continue with my argument. My first argument is top-down historiography is essential for national stability and coherent education in post-conflict state. In post-conflict state, stability is extremely fragile and needed. Post-conflict state needs to recover from civil war, colonialism, and dictatorship, and oftentimes it creates distrust between the citizen. In these situations, what are needed is not sobbing emotional story of their loved ones, because that would mean reopening an old wound they don't want to remember. What they need is a mutual understanding that they are now rebuilding the nation, and textbooks are the tool for this stabilization. My second argument is prioritizing bottom-up risks deepening division rather than promoting reconciliation. Why, you might ask, which is a good question, because bottom-up narratives center around the suffering citizens bear, the oppression that citizens bear, and historical resentment. Different groups of citizens may hold completely different stories from the same conflict, which is why I stated that bottom-up historiography will take a lot of perspective. It will take so many perspectives from the citizens, and that will easily create division rather than promoting reconciliation, as I stated before. When the state prioritizes this sobbing emotional story, citizens begin a commotion whether whose suffering deserves a greater recognition. Instead of unifying, it is creating an even bigger gap between the people. Can you imagine if one is suffering a different story than the one being depicted in the history books? Can you imagine just what happened? There will be a comparison, there will be a comparative narrative, and that will be bad, because that will create a division rather than unifying the nation that we need to rebuild. Therefore, while the government focuses on emotional appeal, the opposition focuses on the practical outcomes, the real-life outcomes, and not just assumption of how citizens feel. In post-conflict state, history education should prioritize stability, coherence, and mutual understanding. Stability is needed to rebuild the post-conflict state that has been divided by the distrust between communities. Stability and coherent history are needed because we need to rebuild the nation, not dividing them. For these reasons alone, we proudly oppose the motion on today's motion, I repeat again, in post-conflict states, this House believes that history textbooks should focus on teaching bottom-up historiography rather than top-down historiography. Thank you.